Hello, my name is Caleb Burnett, and welcome to my 5th feature film. This film is the epic finale to the Chu trilogy, and this is called Chu and the Final Showdown of the World. Anyway, let's recap the last two stories. In the Dojo Master, we figured out how Chu and Wuhan reconciled with their friendship, how they went from their enemies into best friends. We also went over, in Rise of the Emperor, the death stakes that were up for Chu, but how he defeated them, and how he took over the world as the new Emperor of Setsuji Square. But now in this final story, it will be a mix of nostalgia and an epic quest. A quest in order to end Kung Fu once and for all. And that's exactly what this story is gonna be about. So let's begin. But first, this will be the final time we'll ever do the paralogs. So paralog 1. There was basically 4 centuries of Kung Fu. The first century consisted of the Master of All, who was born on that century and who officially started Kung Fu once as we know it. He was the greatest of all the masters, and he was the greatest of all that came before him, and after him. And also on this same century, the masters of Earth, Wind, Fire, and Water came into play. And this is where the first century of Kung Fu officially kicked off. And at that time, only 4 masters, well actually 5, but 4 masters and 1 ultimate master. And they ruled throughout all the lands of Kung Fu. Next up came the 2nd century of Kung Fu. This is where the Zodiac Masters came into play. And the Chinese animal masters. For example, the ox, the boar, the pig, the dog, and countless other animals. That was basically the recap of the 2nd century of Kung Fu. Now we reach into the 3rd century. In the 3rd century, not much happens, but we start getting some very less common masters, and some typical masters nowadays. This is kind of the age of the modern masters. The modern masters were very skilled at their time, but nowhere near as skilled as the Master of All, who was the complete ruler of all of Kung Fu. So while they were never gonna make it to the Master of All, they still had very great speeds, and they had very great skills, and they used these skills in order to defeat extreme masters. And now we reach into the current century of Kung Fu, the 4th century of Kung Fu. This is where our story takes place, and this is where our Kumpat Chu, which we'll discuss a bit later, comes into play. Paralog 2. So we already know the history of Kung Fu, but let's have another recap about what a Kumpat is. A Kumpat is a creature in the shape of a cylinder. They have a dome head on the top. So they have a dome noggin, if you want to call it. That's where their brain is. And they have little arms and little feet. And they always wear sandals, although some could be absolutely barefoot, which is disgusting. Anyway, but that's what Chu is. As well, Kumpa adults can only be around 3 feet tall, not because they are required to, but that's just how their genetics work and how their DNA works. As well, baby Kumpats are also very short, only about 1 foot tall at the max. Anyway, so let's continue the story. As you can see right now, I'm currently near the Twin Towers of Chuan, and Chu's is on the left tower. But very soon, someone will occupy the right tower. So let's begin. It is now nighttime in Sensoji Square, and for all of Japan and China. The world is pretty silent, but on the other side of the world is daylight. Cities are busting with business, and people are talking an awful lot. However, not in Sensoji Square for right now. It was about midnight at this point, or maybe even 1 in the morning. Anyway, the Twin Towers of Chuan were located near a river, and the river was part of the 3 rivers and the Tri-Rivers. Anyway, at that point, while Chu and his gang were sleeping in the middle of the night, a mysterious man with a blue sash and a blue belt came to the shore. His name was Marud. Actually, his name was Marud. That's how you say it, Marud. M-A-R-U-D, Marud. Like, you're rude. Anyway, he had a gang of 5 sons, and they were floating around the river on a little boat, a brown boat. The boat was very old. Then they landed on shore, and they decided to climb up the jagged rocks. But they found a path, and they decided to go on that path. And of course, they always made sure to stay clear from injuries. Otherwise, these injuries could have been very fatal to them. Alright, Marud said, here we are, the Twin Towers of Chuan. He was planning to be there so he could occupy the right tower of Chuan. No one had lived in the right tower for many years, or maybe even decades. But whatever the case may be, Marud had a plan, and he overheard about Chu the Kumpat, and how he was one of the greatest kung fu masters of his time, and especially one of the greatest that was a Kumpat. Kumpats weren't really common kung fu masters, but Chu was quite a common phenomenon. He practically appeared everywhere. Sometimes even middle-aged girls and teenage girls would go up to him, literally wanting him to be his boyfriend. However, Chu always declined that, as he wasn't made for human love. He was made for human love, though, but never in a romantic way. But whatever the case may be, Marud's clan decided to get into the tower, and they occupied that tower. They stayed there for the rest of the night. They slammed the door behind them, and spreading a lot of chaos into Sensoji Square. Anyway, the next morning was quite a sunny morning. Chu and his clan woke up, and they were feeling very refreshed. They had a nice long sleep. But Chu soon discovered something that he probably should have not discovered, and that was Marud's clan was there. Now, Chu didn't know Marud, but he hadn't seen him in an incredibly long time. The last time Chu and Marud had ever met together was practically back in their teenage years. Anyway, with all that said, Chu and his clan decided to get some breakfast, and had some Japanese food as always, and specifically some yogurt bowls with some fruit balls in it. This is delicious, Chu said. Yeah, man, it is, Lamode said. Well, I like this day so far. We're having a nice warm breakfast, and there's like nothing that can really stop us now. Yeah, really, Lamode said. Anyway, however, while they were eating breakfast, Hugh noticed something out the window. Hey, Do you guys notice this out the window? I think there's something wrong outside. Something wrong. It seems a little fishy, Chu said. He hadn't really noticed what had happened last night. He may have heard the door slam, but honestly didn't really hear much else, as Chu was already dead asleep at that time. He then found that the Maroods clan had been there, and they noticed that they were doing something. He noticed that they were doing something rather wrong, and Chu desperately had to stop them, and so his clan chose to stop them as well. Without that said, Chu and his clan rushed outside and started screaming at them. Hey, what are you doing? Anyway, maybe that's how they did react. Anyway, but basically they were trying to aggressively confront Marood, as Chu had already known Marood. It had been countless years. After countless years, they had finally met together once again. Well, Marood said. If it isn't Chu the Kumpat. Yeah, that's right, Marood. It's me, Chu the Kumpat. And yes, he said that. Well, I just wanted to see how you're doing. I just came in to have a new neighbor. Oh, really? A new neighbor? Well, explain that. Chu was pointing to a weapon that the Maroods had been planning out. It was an unknown weapon of some sort, but Marood didn't want to cover it up. Oh, it's just my turbulator. Really, your turbulator? Yes, it is, Marood said. It's my turbulator. Alright, but I'm telling you, something's gotta be fishy about this. At that point, Marood's clan decided to head off, and Chu decided not to confront them anymore. Instead, they went off and did their own thing. They went back inside to continue eating their breakfast, and after they continued eating their breakfast, they finished their food and put away their dishes. And Chu helped clean the dishes with the help of Lamode, as Lamode could literally do human things, and he could also literally do human things and clean dishes in an instant using his technology, his advanced technology, in fact. Anyway, soon after that, the mornings officially started for the Chu clan, and so did the Marood clan. At that point, they decided to do some activities. For example, Chu was deciding to do some painting, and he really enjoyed that, and some of the other clan members also started to do the things that they have really liked to do. For example, we talked about some of their characteristics earlier, but Chu was mostly an artist and a writer. Lamode was, well, just a robot. And the 5 sons were all into different things, some of them being super strength, working out, physical fitness, and emotional intelligence and empathy, and even sympathy too. All 7 members had their own unique abilities, and that was pretty good. Anyway, but while they were doing that, they overheard Marood. Meanwhile, Marood was discussing some evil plans to eliminate Chu once and for all. So, let's get rid of Chu, shall we? Oh really, why should we? One of Marood's sons said. His name was Garood. Alright, Garood, I think that sounds pretty amazing, but how we do it? Simple, we always do a kung fu fight. A kung fu fight, that sounds pretty good. Marood was treating it like a special dinner menu. Dinner, right? Looks like we'll have Kumpat for dinner. No, we're not gonna eat him, said Garood, but we're just gonna defeat him. Oh yeah, Maybe then we'll eat him. No, we're not gonna eat him. You can never even eat a kumpat. And fun fact, kumpats are actually inedible. If you try to taste it, it will taste extremely horrible, and you will definitely get some nausea and stomach aches. So I don't recommend eating kumpat. Anyway, alright, said Maroon, that actually sounds pretty good. So, you want to get started? Sure, but first we have to wait for the right moment. At that point, Chu was already in his room, and he was talking to Senpai until Senpai brought this up, saying, I think there's someone you ought to be afraid of, Chu. Oh really, who is it? Chu said. It's a certain character of yours, and he just moved in. Wait a minute, Marud? That's impossible, how could... Oh no, he could possibly want me. Well, I won't give this up. Alright, goodbye, Senpai. Alright, Senpai, bye. And so Senpai decided to leave, and Chu went off to leave too. Soon after, Chu's clan decided to literally confront Marud and his clan. They noticed that things were relatively off about the clan, and he already knew it from the unsupervised weapon. Well, said Chu, are we about ready to fight? What are we fighting for? Lamode said. We're gonna fight for Marud. Anyway, they then went out to the large dojo circle called the Dojo of Duso. And the Dojo of Duso was relatively a big circle, a perfect circle in fact, that measured about 50 feet wide and 50 feet long. It had a diameter of 50 feet. Well, Marud said. He was doing this as Chu's clan was coming up. So, are we ready to fight? Oh yes, we're ready to fight, Chu said. And as they were about to fight, memories of Chu started coming back. This is now the section in which we go over Chu's life, which we haven't really discussed in full, but this movie is gonna be the place to do it. This now serves as the part in which we discuss Chu's life, which is actually the main topic and the main concern of this film. This is the part in which we get to learn about who Chu was and who he wanted to be. Basically, Chu was born on September 13th, 1919. And on that day, there were some kumpats that were trying to march to freedom until Senpai brought along a baby kumpat and his name was Chu. Alright fellas, Senpai said, this right here is Chu, and he is the father of Cho and the father of Chango. Anyway, he was a very baby kumpat, and was not really large at all. In fact, he was maybe only about 6 inches tall. This is a really small kumpat. Yeah, no, it's a precious kumpat, one kumpat said. Kumpats were very servile, and they could practically do anything they ever wanted to do. Anyway, but Senpai ordered the kumpats to take care of the baby kumpat, to take care of Chu. Soon after, Chu was very little and could hardly even speak a word. He didn't even speak his first word until he was about 4 months old. Even though he couldn't speak at that much, he was still quite very clever kumpat. He would sometimes point to things, and he would thankfully see where things were, and that was a special ability of his. He could literally see things from far away, and that's what made his abilities seem wonderful to the world of Kumpatin. Kumpatin was a place and a village full of Kumpats, kind of like Hobbiton from Lord of the Rings. Kupatin was basically an entire mud festival. It was a mud parade with countless mud objects, and practically the one thing that they only cared about was mud. They would eat the mud, drink the mud, and do many other things. In fact, Kumpats were actually made out of mud, which is probably a little gross fact to think about, but this is actually true in Kumpat mythology. Anyway, the Kumpats were then marching on. They were doing this so that way they could cross the third river, one of the three rivers of the Tri-Rivers, in which this was where Chu had lived nearly 90 years later, a little over 90 years later in fact. From there, the Kumpats marched on, and they decided to take rest every now and then. Chu's first memory probably had to be the harsh, cold winter of that year. It was about December of 1919, and things were profoundly frigid for the time. China was facing a massive cold out, with tons of things going away for good. Energy was lost, and power outages were everywhere. Chu himself was kinda crying, but soon after, he learned how to deal with it. This is where he was able to survive, and this is where he developed his survival instincts. From there, Chu became quite immense, and this is where he got his super abilities from. He was able to survive, and survive countless challenges. In fact, Kumpats could actually go back, and in fact, Kumpats could actually not even eat food, and they could survive without food for about 4 weeks or an entire month. So Kumpats had a well-advanced body than human beings. They were also allowed to live much longer, with lifespans about 120 years to 150 years. And that's much of the Kumpat as we know it. The history of the Kumpat is very complex, and we'll get more into that later. The Kumpats were very cold and frozen at that time. It seemed like they were gonna be hydrogenically frozen at some point. But whatever the case may be, they survived. January 1920 came and quickly rolled around. Things were starting to get slowly much more warmer. Then, Kumpats eventually got their freedom in July of 2020, after they had been denied freedom for over 5 years. The journey all started in July of 1915, when Senpai was relaxing. He was currently being servitive of a Kumpat. And while he was being servitive of Kumpats, an unknown man decided to wipe out all Kumpats, and he decided to capture Kumpats and sell them. He also incited violence against Kumpats and harm to Kumpats. He also intended to have their rights taken away and be treated like wild animals. And this is where harmful stereotypes about Kumpats started being spread. They were spreading left and right, and it seems like Kumpats were practically the survival topic that no one ever wanted to talk about. But that didn't stop Senpai, as soon he carried out a quest of his own. Senpai could not come as he wanted to fight with the others. But instead, he had about 12 Kumpats, and each of the Kumpats were, of course, Kumpats, but 6 of them were youngins, and 6 of them were oldins. And so, they marched on from July 1915 to July 1920, exactly 5 years from now and then. They crossed across a loop, and they crossed across the loop to show symbolic reverence to how Kumpats should live, when they face hard challenges, they should walk an entire length circle. And from there, that was how the march was formed. The march was very uncomfortable. It had 5 winters, 5 springs, 5 summers, and 5 falls. So 20 seasons in total. The first fall was relatively easy. However, the winters were of course always very frigid. At that point, only about 11 Kumpots remained. As well, some Kumpots drowned in rivers. By the end, only 2 Kumpots remained after their march ended in July of 1920. After that day, Kumpots were officially declared free, and thus the journey of Kumpots officially began, and civil rights were eventually amended to Kumpots. This is how Chu is able to live nowadays. With Chu now being able to live nowadays, it also gave the pathway for him to become a Kung Fu master. Anyway, so now we have reached the first about 9 months of Chu's journey from being a baby Kumpot, and now we officially start his childhood. His childhood began with his mother and his father, Cho and Chango, reunited. They had been reunited, and they had been secretly waiting for Chu. Cho gave birth to Chu quite long ago, but she didn't see him again until after July 1920. Senpai was also the grandfather of Chu, so they had quite a nice family together. They would sometimes talk about philosophy, but Chu wasn't much interested at first, but then as the years went on, he decided to have a love for philosophy. And from there, that's where he developed his love for English and writing. Anyway, at that point, Chu and his family decided to move into a nice house, and Kumpots were now able to live in houses. They bought their first house in August of 1920, and from there, that's where Chu spent his time growing up. He wasn't able to speak quite yet, but he may be able to. In fact, he didn't speak his first word until he was 1 year old. Anyway, and the first word he said was, "Mommy." That was his first words he ever said. Anyway, as adorable as Chu was starting to grow up, Chu was also starting to develop his interests much more. Of course, he had developed English and writing, but he also developed a love for art. He read a lot of books when he was a kid, but sometimes the things that would fascinate him the most was the art of the books. The art of the books was something that Chu had always wondered how to make, and so with the right skills, he decided to make up a book and make some artwork for the book, and that's how he officially started his writing career. He started making books ever since he was a little kid, probably around 3 or 4 years of age. His drawing gradually grew over time, and he eventually published his first book in 1923 called A Children's Kumpot, and soon after released a sequel in 1924 called Another Children's Kumpot. The books were basically essentially poetry and short stories concerning Kumpots. Chu was profoundly gifted and was very ahead for his time. In fact, that's where he got the idea to build a moat, since he was incredibly smart, but he honestly didn't really have anyone to fit into. He was kind of his own separate mold, and that was kind of one of the unfortunate isolating things about Chu. Nonetheless, Chu decided to make friends. Friends were pretty slow at first, but he soon got used to it over time. It just took the right skills and the right people in order for him to develop his friendship. By the time he had developed his friendships, he was already a much acclaimed name. he started getting friends for real, and that's where his fame began. He was quite considered different because he was indeed a Kumpat. But that didn't stop Chu from being one of the greatest of his time. Anyway, so we've gone over Chu's childhood and things like that, but now we're going to start getting into his educational journey. So at first, Chu went to a normal school. He was a Kumpat in a normal school full of humans. Sure, it may have been a little weird for Chu, but he was willing to see the human world and see what things were going to be like never before. So his mother often encouraged him to do well in school, and Chu quite did. But who knows, but the hardest thing that was for Chu was practically the people. He was probably gonna have to deal with a lot of strangers, and things that he generally didn't want to deal with ever in his life. However, Chu decided to grow up and decide to get over his hatred of people. Now, I'm not saying that Chu ever had hatred for people, but he generally didn't like people who threatened him in his community. Chu was also an outspoken of his time. He often wrote stories about Kumpats and was often trying to make a difference. And that was the purpose for Chu. He was a little Kumpat wanting to make a big difference in a world full of humans. At that time, Kumpats were almost wiped out entirely. However, while most of the Kumpats were wiped out and inevitably died, some Kumpats decided to stay resistant. It was unclear why Kumpats were starting to vanish entirely, but basically, there were some that survived. The main reason was most likely because of the Kumpat disease, which was where a Kumpat would be incredibly sick, and they would die soon after. However, Chu and his family were among some of the lucky ones to not get affected by this virus. In fact, they always had immunizations. Kumpats didn't know the cure for the time, but then they eventually discovered the cure starting in the 1920s, and it only took about a year for it to get published worldwide. Kumpats were outspoken creatures, and unlike anything else, and some people unfortunately treated them with fear, stigma, and prejudice. But that didn't stop Chu and his family, as he kept trying to get recognized from the entire world. Anyway, so Chu decided to take a bus to school. He took the bus to school and sat with no one there. He honestly felt like the complete outsider, which was quite reasonable because he was indeed a Kumpat, and Kumpats were known for being out of touch in the human world. But nonetheless, the bus drove off, and Chu sat in silence. He was instead thinking about all the things he was wanting to tell, and just wanted to see what the human world was like. He definitely wanted to see what it's like, but he was honestly too scared. And that was one of his biggest fears of being a Kumpat. He was worried that he was going to get mocked of some sorts. But Chu always kept pushing through, pushing the boundaries of what he was going to be. And that's what made him very special from the start. Then, the bus finally came out of the school. It was called Sensuji School, and it was basically a school for all ages, kindergartners to 12th graders. Chu walked in and went to his classroom, and from there, he did not absolutely know anything that was going on. He heard a lot of shouting, and it seemed like things were really tough for Chu, and they definitely were. Chu had never really been into school that much, as since he was profoundly gifted, he honestly just didn't feel like he wanted to do things that were meant for other humans, and meant for other minds not like himself. Nonetheless, Chu walked in, and from there, he decided to sit in silence. He was often feeling sad. That was when a specific boy decided to call him a loser. This is the moment that made Chu incredibly sad, but after the boy called him again, he started getting angrier. After a third time, it got angrier, and by the fourth time, Chu had eventually struck him. This was where Chu developed his fighting skills, and this is where Chu had first ever fight. It was not a pretty fight, of course. The kid was eventually rushed with a bloody nose, and Chu felt incredibly sorry. His mother was enraged, but she also knew right from the start that Kumpot going to a human school was probably not going to be the best idea for Chu. Instead, she often decided to homeschool him. So she did that over the next 3 years. And over the next 3 years, Senpai, Cho, and Chango decided to homeschool Chu. And this is where he developed a much more better education. Senpai especially was a very good teacher, as he himself had been a teacher for many years and decades. Beforehand, he used to teach things about everything to Kumpots, but also taught things to humans too. He worked with both Kumpots and humans alike, as well as some animal creatures. Anyway, so thus Chu started his homeschooling career, and from there, things were going relatively well. Things were much more self-paced, and he was really enjoying them. One day, he was walking in the street, and then he found a flyer. This was a flyer for a Kung Fu festival, but he also saw one for a Kung Fu school. Ooh, special. Very special. I know, I did that, of course. That was to signify how this was to Chu. Anyway, Chu then immediately got interested, and thus this is where he eventually decided to have his love for Kung Fu officially begin. His love for Kung Fu grew right at this moment. At that moment, he encouraged his parents to roll him along. Cho and Chango were a little hesitant at first, but they knew that Chu had finally found something he was interested in, and this is where things would get better for Chu and his family. Senpai was incredibly thrilled, and he spoke advice to Chu almost every day about what he should do if someone ever threatened him. Chu himself was quite a bit wise, but not as wise as Senpai, of course, as Senpai was the wisest of all the Kumpots that ever lived. Anyway, Cho and Chango eventually enrolled Chu in the Kung Fu school. And from there, that's when Chu's Kung Fu journey officially began. The next day, he decided to get up quite early, and from there, he got together his lunch and packed up his things. This was for homeschool, as Chu would have to pack his own lunch, and he would do this so that way he could be prepared for packing his own lunch in the future. Anyway, after Chu was homeschooled, his parents decided to walk him to the Kung Fu school. It was unknown. Chu did not know the name of the Kung Fu school, but it was something along the lines of Sensoji Center for Kung Fu. Something along those lines, but Chu was not really exactly sure. And I'm not exactly sure either. Nonetheless, Chu walked in, and it was a thrilling experience. He was watching kids grow up and watching Kung Fu from the tip of their tongues. They were also learning languages, as Kung Fu itself was kind of a language too, in which they would learn specific accents by their masterful instructor. Chu then got on board and decided to go along with the instructor. The instructor was incredibly nice towards Chu. And that's where Chu developed his friendship skills. And his friendship skills would play an important part in his life, especially for his work on Lamode and his 5 sons named Hugh, Ru, Lu, Nu, and Wu. Going in alphabetical order, that is, from oldest to youngest. Nonetheless, Chu walked in and automatically decided to sit down, ready to do some action. The instructor started by saying, "Hello everyone," he said. "Today we're going to be doing some Kung Fu, but first we have to do some learning." Chu was unfortunately a little dissatisfied about this, but he realized that Kung Fu had to be with some learning curves, so he eventually learned about it. The first lesson that was ever taught towards Chu was the history of Kung Fu. And we've gone over this numerous times, but they talked about the 4 centuries of Kung Fu. Well, 3 centuries at the time, since the 4th century did not roll around until 2000. They talked about the master of all, and how he was the greatest master of all masters that ever lived. He was the one that truly started Kung Fu. They also talked about the 4 masters of earth, wind, fire, and water. From there, they talked about basically, here was how the curriculum was set up. The curriculum was set up like a history class. First, they went over the history of Kung Fu. They were given quizzes and tests on the 1st century of Kung Fu, a 2nd century of Kung Fu, and a 3rd century of Kung Fu. Overall, 1 century per week. And so Chu studied very hard. He was a little dissatisfied still, but Senpai told him that it was going to be the most important thing, especially if you really want to know all there was that much about Kung Fu, and if you ever want to be omniscient, then like Senpai was. Senpai was indeed omniscient, but there was still a bit of gap. But anyway, Senpai was omniscient, but he was still maybe learning a few things, since Senpai still had a bit of limited memory. Nonetheless, Chu went home and immediately started studying. He studied for about an hour, or at least 30 minutes. 30 minutes over the course of the morning, of the evening, and the morning. Anyway, he then came back and the class answered questions about the history of Kung Fu. Chu got at least 1 answer right, and he was pretty satisfied about this. The next day came, and Chu got 2 answers right. But the next day, Chu didn't get any answers right. He was worried. Chu said to himself that he better shape up, or else he might even fail the test. However, Chu, with his optimism, decided to give it another try. And from there, he practiced as much as he could. So that way he could be an omniscient Kung Fu master like Senpai was. Senpai was indeed aged in the 2, and he was getting near his 85th birthday. After that, Senpai would only have about 35 to 65 more years to live. But things were soon gonna be cut short for him due to an immensely infamous fight that he had. Nonetheless, Chu kept learning and learning and learning. Anyway, he ultimately passed the Kung Fu test with a 90%. And from there, he started working on the 2nd century of Kung Fu. After getting answers right, he got a 95. And after a 3rd century, he got a 100. Chu was feeling mastery. The 4th week of Kung Fu school was mostly just a review and practicing for the big chunk of the test. The final test for the first month of for the history of Kung Fu was basically 60 questions, and it was slightly different and worded questions than what Chu and the students had been doing in class, and what they were doing on the test before. Chu decided to study as much as he could, and so he ultimately did. At that point, Chu decided to study day and night. He studied day and night, but still maintaining sleep. And that's how Chu was able to have his learning stamina built up over time. It was one of his greatest tools ever, and that's what made him stand out from other students in the class. The day of the final test came, and Chu was ready for it. After weeks of studying, and days of studying, and hours and minutes of studying, and maybe even seconds of studying, he went in and he did the best with his test. Soon after, on Monday of the 5th week, he got his results back and he got a perfect score. Chu was so excited that he could not really focus, but he decided to off a little bit later and instead focus on his real skills. Then it was after the 4th week and starting on the 5th week, this is where the Kung Fu techniques actually started to kick in. And this was the most exciting part about the entire curriculum of Kung Fu. Anyway, after months of practicing, they spent months and months practicing. And they had monthly final tests. So they had final tests every month to prove their skills. And Chu was acing it. He was a perfect star student. He was still learning along the way. After Kung Fu school had ended, which had been 7 weeks later, Chu eventually got his first belt, the red belt. And this is where his Kung Fu journey officially began. And this is where his acclaim of Kung Fu officially began. He was not really much known at the time, but basically Chu had an idea to get himself recognized from all across the world, and all across Sensoji Square. He decided to host some Kung Fu duels. And while he was hosting Kung Fu duels, kids would challenge him, and Chu would show off his brave skills. Chu was very gentle with them, but Chu was ultimately a clear winner, and he kept going and going and going. Soon after 3 months, school started again, and Chu was in 1st grade. And once again, they homeschooled Chu. And they would homeschool Chu all the way until the rest of his days, until the summer of 1938, which is when he graduated high school. Anyway, also starting in September, Chu's 2nd year of Kung Fu school began. And this is where they start getting into much more advanced techniques. And by advanced techniques, this is where Chu developed some major backing skills. This is where he developed things like the spin attack, and even some of his own moves. He didn't always follow the rule book of Kung Fu, but he was always on top of the game, and he was indeed a perfect master. Around the time he was recognized, he officially started winning Kung Fu duels, with his first major recognition, and Chu was only 8 years old, almost 9 by that time. He had always where he was now, which is where he is. And so he holds a record, winning for 82 years in a row, actually 83, from 1928 to 2010, which is when our story takes place. He was practically undefeated and was considered, quote-unquote, the greatest Kung Pao master of all time, and the greatest Kung Fu master of all time. It was quite revolutionary. Often invented new things that hadn't really been invented before. And that's where Chu developed his signature move. He was on top of the game and on top of the world at the point. Anyway, soon after, Chu finished his second year of school and his second year of home school and Kung Fu school. After Kung Fu school, it was time. After Kung Fu school ended, he developed an art studio, and that's where he officially started getting a lot of pictures in his life. And Chu was quite prolific artist, sometimes taking about 10 pictures in just one day. And since Chu was incredibly prolific, Senpai greatly encouraged him to keep on going. Senpai was practically Chu's leader just for a while, and he was the one that kept Chu free after all these years. The years went by. And at this point, Chu was still growing much more advanced in his time being. He developed much more new Kung Fu skills and techniques, and this is what made him a top-tier Kung Fu master, and one of a Kumpai, in fact. He continued to fight for quite a long time. He fought for an incredibly long time, and he didn't ever stop from there. Soon after, Chu started his third year of Kung Fu school and homeschool, and he aced that. And so he did for his 4th year, his 5th year, his 6th year, his 7th year, his 8th year, his 9th year, his 10th year, his 11th year, and his 12th year. Chu eventually finished Kung Fu school in 1938, but he decided to do 2 more years, and that was where he eventually got his black belt. His black belt was the most prized possession that he ever had. If someone tried to take that away from him, he would be enraged and want to literally start a fight with you. So please don't take his stuff. Anyway, so after that, he decided to go off to college for a bit. He went to a Kumpai college, and from there, that's where he started having real education with a bunch of other Kumpais. It was also a mix of humans too, but Chu was much more mature now to finally have some meaningful connections with some humans. And from there, he grew on his sympathy, empathy, and his emotional intelligence skills. And that's what made Chu stand out amongst other Kumpais. Kumpais were maybe even rude. However, Chu was not a rude person himself. Instead, Chu treated everyone with kindness, and that was his main ethos. So Chu attended college for 2 years. After he attended college for 2 years, he then continued to do college until 1942. Rewind back to 2 years ago. Chu got his black belt for the first time. Chu's Kung Fu teacher was quite old now. He was now in his 90s, and he was in very ill condition. He decided to have one last fight, and so Chu won the fight. However, he soon died shortly after. Almost instantly, in fact. Almost immediately. However, Chu witnessed this, and he thought the day couldn't get much worse. He went back home and had to tell the news, but meanwhile his folks were also very sad, and this is also because Senpai had passed away. He had lost his fight. He had lost a big fight in a Bloodmaster's duel, and the Bloodmaster took his own life, and that was how Senpai's wisdom came to be. The next few months and days were relatively sad, and in fact profoundly sad for Chu and his family. They had lost his kung fu teacher, and they had lost his grandfather. As a result, Senpai was eventually cremated, but about a few months later, he was placed into an elderly candle, and that was basically a Christmas gift in December of 1940. And Chu decided to keep the candle because they knew that Senpai was the most important person to Chu. He was the person that he looked up on all his life. And so he kept it there, and it's been in Chu's room for almost 70 years. Chu eventually finished college. He finished his junior and senior year, and once again got perfect grades and was a star student. He was also a valedictorian of the college, and so he eventually graduated in 1942, at the age of 22. Now Chu's education was over, but he was now unsure about what he was even going to do for the rest of his life. I mean, think about it. Now that you're done, what would you even want to do after that? Chu thought rigorously about what he would want to do. However, Chu eventually decided to keep doing kung fu. Anyway, but this is where he started getting real jobs. In 1943, he officially launched his own art studio called Chu's Art Studio, and this is where the Kumpai himself, Chu, would display his artwork. He was not as prolific at the time in college and in the later years of his schooling days, but he still managed to make a prolific output, making about 7 to 8 pictures a day. At that time, Chu had over 10,000 pictures. Actually more like 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, maybe even 50,000 or 100,000. However the quantity may be, Chu was indeed a prolific person. This is also around the time he started to write about stories. And these stories were about his own life. They were basically fictional narratives and kind of non-fictional narratives pulled together. And that's where he developed stories of his own. It was often based on his own life experiences. And that's what gave Chu's stories a very unique charm. They were unlike anything else at the time, and people heavily praised his stories. His stories were even inducted, and even won a few awards now and then. He had been writing stories since 1923, but he hadn't eventually started making it till about 1943, actually. Anyway, his first official book was a remaking and a 20th anniversary edition of A Children's Kumpat. And in 1944, the sequel, another children's Kumpat, was eventually given a 20th edition, a 20th anniversary, and was released. The two books prior to 20 years ago were actually for Chu and his family, for Chu, Senpai, and his family to read for you. But Chu didn't originally want to get them published, thinking that no one would work. He eventually gave it a try. The books from 1943 and 1944 were profound. And at that time, this is where Chu got much acclaim from. At that time, in 1945, he won his first ever award and became the youngest Kumpai to do so at age 25. Senpai was the second youngest, doing it in his late 20s, early 30s. But he definitely won. Senpai couldn't actually see Chu, but he heard about Chu even past his death, so Senpai was sort of like a moral. Even after his death of Senpai, he was still able to support Chu after after all those years, the 1940s basically continued, and Chu was starting to become a much more publicized figure. He wasn't controversial at all, but this is where most got it. The rest of the 1940s went along pretty smoothly. Around this time, this is where Chu eventually decided to get a teacher job, and he decided to teach some of the favorite things ever, and those things were English and writing. In 1948, he decided to apply for a writing and English job at Old University, and he taught there for quite a long time. He taught there from 1948 to 1974, so for a total of 26 school years, making him the longest Kumpat to ever teach there. Meanwhile, in the 1940s wrapped up pretty well for Chu, and now it's time for the 1950s. Chu was starting to grow a little bit alone, and his popularity was starting to wane. However, he was eventually given a second chance, and this second chance was basically to become a leader in Sensoji Square. Chu had lived in Sensoji Square practically all his life, and this is now the moment. At that time, Chu had decided that he wanted to get recognized even more, and so to do this, he only became a mayor of Sensoji Square. He did that in the 1950s and 1960s. He ran for a total of 3 terms, and eventually retired in 1968, actually 1972. So ranging from 1956 to 1972, with a total of 6 years of each term, so from 1956 to 1962 to 1968 to 1974. At that time, Chu had reached age 55, and not much really happened at that time. Chu eventually quit his job anyway, but now he was much more focused on doing a band. So Chu decided to form a band and call it the Kumpats. Around this time, he had 5 sons, and at this point, they were about in their teenage years, practically 2 years over teenage age. So, with the things that he had planned now, he decided to run a band called the Kumpats. They formed in the end of 1974, and they basically recorded their first album in 1975, and eventually released it in 1976, called the Kumpats. They also released a second album in 1977, then again in 1979, 1980, 1982, and their 6th and final album in 1984. Chu also got a solo career, and it started with his first solo album called Me, released in 1987. His second album, Here Comes Chu Again, was released in 1988. He continued to make solo albums up until 2001, with a total of 7 solo albums altogether. Chu had mostly known for music career. His main thing was Kung Fu, and that's when he eventually formed his own clan. By around 1978, he decided to form a clan called the U Clan. The U Clan, in fact, with the U sounding like 2 O's together. U. Anyway, they formed together in 1978, and they eventually became super successful, and became one of the most successful clans in all of Sensoji Square, and practically all over the world. They were practically everywhere, and they were great role models to almost anyone. They did receive at least a few complaints from edgy parents, but that didn't really stop them. This only made their success grow even more and more. They continued to fight and fight, and eventually leading to where Chu was today. Not much had really happened since then. His clan had faced a lot of big challenges, and they've mostly stayed active over the 32-year history. After the 32-year history, this is where we start getting into the events of the first and second installment of the series. Anyway, this is the part in which the first and second story intertwine with the past. Anyway, basically, Chu woke up and decided to eat breakfast, but one day, so Chu decided to wake up one day, and he ate breakfast. He was also cooking breakfast for others. He was then warned by Senpai that there was an enemy afoot, and this enemy was a man named Wuhan, one of Chu's old enemies, and this was long before they were even friends. They rushed down to stop Wuhan at his temple. They fought, and Wuhan ultimately won, and Wuhan ultimately lost the fight, and Chu ultimately won. This led to Wuhan ultimately sabotaging Chu for practically a long time. In fact, only about a few days or so. He continued to sabotage him everywhere he went. Basically, Wuhan was practically everywhere in Chu's presence. He confronted him when he was in the sushi place, and Chu ultimately got into a physical fight. However, Chu's girlfriend, Cindy, decided to end the fight altogether. This was to protect her own safety, and to also protect the own safety of the Kumpas themselves. Well, Wuhan wasn't a Kumpa but human, but this is to prevent human and Kumpa alike from ever attacking each other. Soon after that, Wuhan decided to kidnap Chu and his clan, and including his robot named Wuhan. After he did that, Chu was utterly enraged and stormed out of his house, slamming the door, and rushing very quickly to Wuhan's temple. And once again, this led to a second fight, and Wuhan was once again defeated in this fight. Wuhan then got another idea and sabotaged Chu once again. This time, he did it in a dragon costume, and that was where Chu's most infamous moment came out. People started laughing at him because of his outburst. However, Chu remained resilient, and he soon regretted this action, but he also felt it was very right, since Wuhan would not really stop pestering him all the way through. Wuhan eventually decided to get sad, but they decided to have one more fight. This was also the time in which Chu eventually started to reconcile with Wuhan. They did so in that way they wouldn't have to fight anymore, while except in a playful way. Soon after, Wuhan and Chu got into one final fight, and after the fight, they eventually became friends again. This was all triggered after Wuhan saw his name on Chu's dojo stick, and that dojo stick was actually a gift from Wuhan. Wuhan had given the stick to him, and he actually crafted it. Sure, the stick was incredibly old, but it was still very useful for Chu. It would be one of his favorite gifts, but Chu also had other kung fu sticks. He even had one from Senpai from many decades ago, and that was one of Chu's greatest gifts, if not his favorite gift. And in fact, one of his favorites, and if not his favorite dojo stick that he had ever received or gotten. Chu had gotten that stick from his birthday, especially when he was about 10 years old. Anyway, but Wuhan and Chu eventually reconciled, and they decided that they were officially gonna be friends. Chu and Wuhan then broke the news to both of their clans, one to each other, and they eventually reconciled with the whole clans altogether. The clans ultimately spent much more time together, and this is where their bond really started to take shape and form. Wuhan was much more nicer and pleaser to Chu, and so was Chu to Wuhan. they decided to spend adventures everywhere, and this is where their undying love happened. They continued to be friends, and they still are to this day. However, shortly after this, Chu was then threatened by another threat, and this one was from the evil emperor named Emperor Shu, who was willing to kill Chu once and for all, and he wanted to do this so that way he could rule over all of Kunpat and start anarchy against Kunpats. The Kunpats eventually fought against this though, and they tried desperately to stop the Emperor once and for all. However, Chu was given only 3 days to do this. So he sought sequence from a master named Master Mugu, who Senpai had recommended, and also that Wuhan recommended too. Actually, Senpai didn't recommend, but Senpai basically told Chu that basically he should find a mentor, and one that should really understand Kung Fu, and that will really help him in his journey. And so, that happened to Chu. Anyway, however, the next day after that, Master Mugu was ultimately murdered, and that's where the intimacy spread. After that infamous day, Chu was deeply sad about what happened, but he continued to fight, and that's where, anyway, but basically, that's where he developed much more of his skills. And that's where he developed his unfearful attitude. He was practically fearless in every sense of the word, and profoundly brave, so nothing could really stop or avenge you. Now we have come back to this moment, and I apologize if we spent a long time on this moment, but now we're officially back to where we began. This is where Chu is right now. This is the final fight of Kung Fu, and only Chu, his clan, and Marud and his clan will witness this moment. This will be the final fight ever to Kung Fu, and who knows what it could bring. So without further ado, here is the final scene of Chu and the Final Showdown of the World, and the final scene entirely of the Chu trilogy. Now, this is the moment we have all been waiting for. The final fight, in which Chu officially ends Kung Fu as we know it. But the century will still go on. But Kung Fu may not even be a thing anymore. Who knows what it could be right now. Whatever the case may be, Kung Fu was all about to end at this exact moment. Now, before you witness this moment, think about all the things that have happened to Chu so far. Think about all the things that have happened to the masters, the master of all. The 4 masters, the master of earth, wind, fire, and water. And think about the animal masters, the 12 of them. Like the dog, the bear, the boar, the sheep. And think about Senpai. Think about all the things he did to Chu in the very beginning while he was still alive. And think about all the things he's doing to him now. Despite him no longer being in Chu's presence, but yet he still lives on as a candle. And that is where Senpai lives now. He will play a much more important part of the story later on. But now, our character at the center of the stage is now Chu himself, Chu the Kunpat. This is the part in which he will decide whether Kung Fu will live or die forever. If he chooses not to, then Kung Fu will be a problem. But if he does end it, then he will be awarded a very special prize. And he will instantly become... Chu had fought almost every master at this point, but there was one he hadn't fought yet. And Chu was ready for it, but profoundly nervous. Imagine like getting a test right, but get only one question wrong. That can feel profoundly hard. Maybe even for me, but maybe not for others. Anyway, I want you to think about what you're gonna witness right now. The final kung fu fight ever to exist. And the finale of this trilogy. I know I'm going on and on, but without further ado, let's pick up where we left off, and let's see the final showdown of the world. Chu walked up to the dojo circle, and he and his clan were waiting there for Marud. Marud had already been there, so at that point there was only one thing left to do now. And the only thing that was left to do now was the fight. Now, this is the part where I want you to take a deep breath. I know. You can take a few deep breaths. Keep going. Anyway, but this is it. This is gonna be the final moment of the trilogy. Anyway, Chu walked up to Murad, and they stood, and they walked slowly and slowly, with each step being much more slower than the last. Then, this was the time of the place to officially start the final showdown of the world. The final ever kung fu fight. And the type of fight that would officially end kung fu, or not, as we may have entirely know it. We have learned so much over this trilogy. We have learned so much about the history of kung fu, its great masters, and soon that history may soon be erased, or maybe will it stay on? Who knows? But whatever the case may be, this is where the trilogy ends. The final showdown of the world. Chu and Marud stood each other face to face, eyes squinted. They stood there for quite a while. Now I want you to think about what would you feel like if you were in Chu's shoes or Marud's shoes? Would you be on the good team or the evil team? And would you want to win or lose? Who knows who would win or lose in a fight? Marud had not much of a clear record, but Chu was almost a flawless person. He was practically invincible in every sense of the word. Now, I want you to think about who you think is most likely to be awarded in this situation. And I want you to think about how the entire world of Sensoji Square will feel about this moment. How you think the entire world will feel about this moment. What about in real life? What about in our dimensions? What about in outer space? Who knows what they could be reacting to right now? But this is the epic part of the trilogy. I know I'm talking too much, but I'm gonna slow things down so we have a nice slow motion pace of the fight. Anyway, they opened their eyes. They stepped back and back, each step being slower than the last, and they were walking backwards. Soon, they waited. They waited together for quite a few seconds, and Chu's clan and Marud's clan didn't really attack at first. They decided to wait for the right moment. At that moment, I would have probably been nervous and on the edge. I would probably be dead inside, just because this is so much a big witness to what we're about to face next. Anyway, then, after they had finished waiting, Chu said, "Attack!" And thus here we go. But before that, let's pause. We've gone to the fight, but how you think this fight will unfold? Who you think will win and who you think will lose? Let's find out. Unpause. Anyway, at that point, they had officially started fighting. Marood was one off with Chu, and Lamode was an assistant to Chu. As well, he was assistant to the other 5 sons, as Chu's 5 sons were also fighting for their lives. They were fighting against Marood's 5 sons, and his 5 brothers, in fact. Anyway, they continued fighting. The fight lasted for quite several minutes, maybe even hours on end. After quite a while, Marood almost lost. However, Chu ultimately was pushed back, and he almost fell off the dojo ring. If a person fell off a dojo ring in a kung fu match, they would ultimately lose. However, Marood wasn't gonna last so long. Any last words, he said? But Chu said no. In fact, never! And so Marood was ultimately kicked off. And that's where we witnessed the final moment. Now, I know you might be tired of thinking about this moment, but wouldn't it be awesome? And wouldn't it be great if this was practically the end of the series? I know, we're getting towards the very end, we're getting towards the good part, hold on. Anyway, so Chu walked up slowly to Marood. Marood was having a hard time getting up. He said, Marood said, would you like to help me? Are you gonna help me? Chu said no, and thus, this is the moment. After that moment, Chu kicked Marood off and physically attacked him. He kicked him off, and Marood fell into the river. He was falling countless feet deep. He ultimately, along the way, he was getting hit by jagged rocks until he finally drowned in the bomb, and thus Marood had died. His 5 sons were unsure what to do, but the Marood clan had ultimately been defeated, and thus this is it. That was the final showdown of the world. The final showdown in which we learned how Chu ultimately defeated the world, and how he became the greatest kung fu master of his time, and of all time now. He was even sure Chu, the master of all, was the creator of kung fu. However, Chu was now the alpha and the omega, so now he was the new master of all. Well, I can't believe I did. Chu said. Did what? Lamode said. I did. My kung fu journey is over. I can't believe it's over now. What are we gonna do now? Well, don't worry, there might be other opportunities. Yeah, right, Lamode. I need a moment. And so Chu took a moment. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts and think about what he had just done. A kung fu master already defeated, and he hadn't really felt more proud of his life. He started to cry a little bit. It took him several minutes to clear up, but soon he finally spoke. Well, clan, I believe our kung fu days are over. And so, the kung fu creatures wept for a bit. They wept about how their adventures were soon gonna end. But Chu said, but this could possibly be a new adventure. In fact, this could probably be our second kung fu journey. Sure, the master of all started kung fu, but look what we did now. We ended kung fu. And so, I think this deserves a toast. Come on, guys, let's go home. Yeah, Lamode said. Yeah, but shouldn't we maybe tell the others? Sure. How about we tell the others? Then, out of nowhere, trumpets rang. After this gong sounded, this is where Chu is ultimately proclaimed the new master of all. And that was where Chu had finally reached fame once again, and now he was the eternal fame. He was now officially omniscient, and he was then given a belt. Anyway, now I want you to step into Chu's shoes. I want you to think about how you think he must feel about this moment. It would be a very great moment if you were in that, right? Well, maybe not. Some people may not even be into Kung Fu. But who knows what you might be into? Because the choices you make will ultimately define your life. Anyway, with all that said, Chu decided to go down into Sensoji Square. They walked slowly, so slowly like a snail's pace, that they made it in just an hour. Meanwhile, everyone was cheering for Chu. All the masters, all the Kumpots, as well as all of the humans, came together to celebrate Chu. This was Chu's biggest accomplishment so far, like his magnum opus of his work. Chu had felt any more prouder of himself. And at this point, he was willing to become the master of all. So, he said. So, someone said, are you ready to become the new master of all? Oh, you bet I am, Chu said. And so, with all that said, Chu became the new master of all. And because he was the new master of all, he was given not a black belt, but a white belt. His white belt represented was the master of all color. However, the master of all belt also contains some special writing, and in some very scripted writing, or kind of like a stylized type of writing, it read, "The master of all has come once again. He will fight all pain, and he will rise again." That was the chorus of the song that they would sing to the master of all. This was a little song in which Kumpots and Kung Fu masters would sing this to someone who had become the new master of all. Now, Chu was the very first, so this was now pretty uncommon for his time. Soon, the ceremony wrapped up, and Chu and his friends were given special awards. Mostly Chu himself. However, his other clan members soon got other rewards too. This included rewards to eat out at the fanciest restaurants, and this was sort of similar to the second film, in which, after Chu became the new emperor, he now officially became the master of all, the new master of all in fact, and even replaced the master of all entirely. With all that said, Chu was incredibly proud, and now he realized that his days were going to get much more bigger. He was now about 90 years old, but in this fall he would be turning 91 years old. Anyway, after the ceremony, countless, if not hundreds of Kung Fu masters came up to Chu and his gang. Wuhan was incredibly thrilled to say, "I'm pretty glad of you, man." "Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Wuhan," Chu said. Chu was always very generous to Wuhan, even though they had been a bit of rivals before. But that all soon changed after he reconciled with Chu, once and for all. Countless other masters like Master Rinha came into the square. He congratulated Chu and said a speech. To all who have witnessed Kung Fu, this is the end. But in that end, there is a new beginning, and we shall be friends, and we shall have faith in the new Master of all. He has guided us towards the way. He has guided us every day into this new journey. He is thankful for our lives. And his thankfulness will only grow bigger if you really care about him. If you really care about him, your life will be blessed. And if so, you will have nice and long days, maybe even eternal days. But whatever that may be, the Master of All is one of the most special people in Sensoji Square, and practically the most important in all of Sensoji Square, and in all of the world. He is practically a peacemaker, and he is a peacemaker too. Actually, he is a peacekeeper too. And so, if we keep his promises of peace, we will soon become powerful than we ever imagined. And that is how we will ultimately live nice and long lives. This is how we were destined to live, and the Master of All has clearly shown us that way. I believe that we all deserve a toast to the Master of All, and to what he's done to us over the years. He was indeed immoral ever since the 1st century of Kung Fu. But now that the 4th century is practically over, after only just 10.5 years, slightly less than 10.5 years, like less than 3 weeks. But I think it's time we give him a toast, and let's now raise a glass to the new Master of All, Chu the Kumpat. And so everyone toasted to Chu the Kumpat, and thus the ceremony was officially over. Music was playing, and Chu spotted Sydney, and Sydney spotted Chu, and Sydney decided to go up to Chu. So I'm pretty proud of you overall, the new Master of All. I know, Sydney. Say, I hate to do this, but would you want to go on a date with me? And so Sydney agreed. Oh yes, I would love to go on a date with you, you little Kumpat. Thank you, Sydney. You're the most beautiful person I've ever met. Okay, Chu didn't really say that literally, but he said something along the lines of, well, I'm very glad. And I think I'm ready to experience love again. And so Chu and Sydney went on a date sometime soon. As for Chu's clan, not much really happened. However, Chu did make one final story. And the story was called The Kumpat III, and read these words. In my life, I've always been special. And in my life, I've always had great secrets of myself. Secrets in which no one else would ever really know about. And I believe that these are the best qualities of me. These are the qualities of what make me wonderful. And I would really like to thank you all so much for those who have helped me. We have had great times together. Anyway, so how did I begin? Well, first, I lived in a mud farm, and the mud farms were often very stinky and didn't really have many good things in them. However, I am very grateful for my life as of now. I have become a new master, and a different type of master. I feel as though I have accomplished quite a lot in a Kumpat's life, or 3/4 of a Kumpat's life, or 3/5 of a Kumpat's life. I like to think every day that I was practically someone very special. And I always knew that no one could really deteriorate me. In fact, these years have just been so great, especially over the last year. I've gotten to meet new friends, and I've gotten to meet you. And the people that I'm I mean by you mean the listeners of the story. I'm grateful for you, the listeners of this story. I like to think that you were always lights in my lives. You always shined wherever you were. And that itself was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. Anyway, but basically you serve as lights in the world. And those lights in the world light up everything, from the cities to the dumps, and even the oceans. Anyway, now I would like to tell you about my big journey that I have spent, and the biggest journey that I've ever went upon. This is my journey now. Here we go. I went to Kung Fu school and was homeschooled. Overall, homeschool and Kung Fu school were profoundly great times in my life. They were pretty good, in fact, that I myself was indeed an accomplished Kumpai in every sense of the word. And I myself was indeed one of the greatest Kumpais ever lived. Well, maybe not then, but now I am. This was now at a time when I lived with Senpai, a great wise Kumpat, and he was pretty omniscient. Because he was omniscient, he practically knew everything. He knew my every thought, and he still is now. He is perhaps the smartest of all the Kumpats that have ever lived. Anyway, I also got to witness death a few times. This was relatively sad, as I saw my master, my Kung Fu teacher, dead right before my eyes. And I did not witness Senpai's death, my grandfather's death. However, I was profoundly saddened by the loss. I was so sad, in fact, that I could not focus for quite a long time. But I recovered. I went back and I recovered. I kept doing my schoolwork and I eventually started my own successful career. This was also around the time I started my very first career, which was being into English and writing, and me being a pedagogue that I was back in the day. I worked there for 26 years, from 48 to 74. As well, from 56 to 74, I became a mayor of Sensoji Square. I was the first Kumpat mayor ever, and that was indeed a very special achievement for me. In fact, Kumpats couldn't even really think about getting into those things at all. However, whatever it may be, I am pretty glad for what I have now. I'm pretty glad that I was able to spend moments with you. I then released a bit of music albums, and even though music wasn't necessarily my real thing, I enjoy it nonetheless. I enjoy music because music can allow you to tell stories. And so I told stories of myself and of my people. And through those, I was able to make commercially successful albums. And that's what inspired me to become one of the biggest stars ever. Sure, I was not prominently known for music, and was moderately successful, but we had so much fun together, me and my clan. You had a lot of fun together, you and your clan. Anyway, around this time, I was also starting to develop a bigger passion project of mine, making my own Kung Fu clan. And it was called the U Clan, or just the letter U, but it's pronounced with like a U. The U Clan was my biggest achievement. We were able to achieve so many things and fight so many great and terrible masters that we call ourselves the Great Victorious. And I know that may sound a little arrogant, but sometimes you must be arrogant when you win. That's sometimes what you must do when you want to show the world who exactly you are. It's okay to be arrogant sometimes, but not all the time. You should be arrogant when you are trying to celebrate your victories. Of course, you shouldn't triumph your victories while sad things are going on, but you should triumph them in happy moments. Anyway, and as of now, I've officially ended Kung Fu once and for all. My days of Kung Fu are over, and so is my clan's are. I got to witness the moment, and I witnessed the final moment of Kung Fu that ever existed. It was relatively sad, but it was a very happy moment for me. And I was also recognized right in front of the entire Sensoji Square. Countless masters and kumpats came up to me, and that was the best part of it all. I'm now thankful for my life, and here ends this story. I hope that you have a great life, and I hope that you have great endeavors. Keep dreaming about who you want to be. Maybe one day you might be the greatest person to ever exist. You could either become a kung fu master, a musician, or you could be like Caleb Burnett making animated films right now. In fact, he's currently making this film right now, and he's almost done with this film. Anyway, but you should be very proud of yourself, and you should be proud of me. And that is the story of Kumpa the Third by Chu. The members of his clan all cheered along, and everyone was very excited for Chu. It was one of Chu's favorite stories that he had ever read at this point. Anyway, and he hoped that the audience enjoy it as much too. It basically served as a final story, and the final story to be written, and the first story to be written after the end of Kung Fu. That night, Chu and Senpai had a little talk. So Senpai said, I am profoundly proud of you. Yes, father, I am proud. Yes, grandfather, I definitely am proud of me. Are you proud of me too? Yes, I am proud of you. And now, you are the master of all. But now you have great responsibilities in the years ahead of you. Now that you're the master of all, who knows what you could be doing now? You can maybe be a peacekeeper. Well, I kinda am a peacekeeper and peacemaker. Well, keep this up. Alright. That was the first conversation Chu and Senpai had after the end of Kung Fu. Anyway, and Chu got together in bed, and he was dreaming about the next big adventure he was gonna have. Lamode was dreaming about robot things as always. And his 5 sons were all thinking about their own dreams, and Chu. The other masters in the world and the other people and Kumpas were all thinking about Chu. He had become the new master of all. And that was one thing that they could never erase. Chu had embraced Kung Fu in every step of the way, and his new journey into being the master of all, was just beginning. And that was the story, and that is the story of the final showdown of the world. And that is the end of this film. I hope that you enjoyed this film, and I hope you enjoyed this 5th feature film. And this was all created in basically less than 200 hours, so I'm pretty proud of this work. Anyway, I hope that you have a great day, and you take a good and profound care of yourself. Sincerely, Caleb Burnett. And I hope that you enjoyed the Chu trilogy as much as I did making it. It was a very profound journey, and I'm very proud of all the work that I've done over the last 5 films. I think you should be proud of me too, and I am myself already proud of myself too. How about you share this with your friends and family, and with all the world. Anyway, I'm Caleb Burnett, the sole creator of this film, And yeah, I hope that you enjoy this film. I hope that you share with all. Sincerely, Caleb Burnett. And now the credits will roll and the characters will be shown for the final time in this Chew film. Hello, my name is Caleb Burnett. I hope that you enjoyed the epic conclusion of the Chew trilogy for the third time. This is film number 19, so film number 20 will be a very special one, as it will be film 2.0, and it will also be Yelk 3D, and that will be very special. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the 5th out of the 7 3D remasters. Anyway, as well, I hope that you enjoyed the remasters and also the experimentation. I do all of these remasters not just for improving quality, but basically to enhance the visual experience for all. So I hope that you enjoyed this film. And also, I forgot what I was gonna say, but basically I like to do these for experimentations, and I like to do these deliberately as a way to experiment. And since that's why these films, even though they have the same story, they can still be considered new films, and also because I'm speaking a message right now, which is going to add more of the originality to the film. But that's what makes these remasters not only just new feature films, but new experiences. So you may think that this is just a same version. Well, it's kind of not, because it's just an experimentation. It's a brand new format. It's a brand new storytelling tool that's being implemented there. Anyway, I think I've gone on for quite far enough. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed the 5th out of the 7 3D remasters, and stay tuned for Yelk. Sincerely, Caleb Burnett.